Welcome to Military Analytics. The heart of the Russia-Ukraine war continues to beat in the Crimea. Crimea, the pearl of the Black Sea, has strategic importance for both countries. For this reason, tension in the region is constantly rising. Vladimir Putin unjustly invaded Crimea in 2014, actually starting the Ukraine war 9 years ago. Now, while Vladimir Putin dreams of invading Ukraine, is he about to lose Crimea, which he annexed years ago? In Crimea, the Russian army was completely panicked, and the Kremlin seems to have started evacuating Russian civilians from the peninsula in case of a possible Ukrainian offensive. Let's take a look at the stunning developments regarding the evacuation of the Russians on the strategic peninsula. According to the latest and updated information, it has been revealed that the Russian administrations in Crimea have prepared evacuation plans for their employees. Russian authorities on the peninsula are making a list of workers and their families who are subject to priority evacuation. In fact, the General Staff of Ukraine states that escape plans have already been created and approved. In some cities, it was announced that such a plan was being prepared in the northern part of the peninsula, close to the Ukrainian mainland in the town of Krasnoperekopsk. This was not the first instance of evacuations in Crimea. In the first days of March, we heard the news that Russian troops took their families from Perevolnoye in Crimea to Russia. It was like a bombshell in the news that the soldiers serving in the Russian forces were trying to smuggle their families out of Crimea by taking precautions against a possible Ukrainian attack. Ukraine's successes on the front lines in a series of drone operations against Crimea are among the most important factors that threaten the Russian presence in the peninsula. In addition, in the last month, the issue of Crimea and evacuation had occupied the agenda. In February, it was reported that the officers in Simferopol, which was under Russian occupation, were preparing to evacuate at the so-called state-owned enterprises of Simferopol. Officers were given to fill out questionnaires in which, in case of evacuation, the full name of the evacuee and the composition of the family were indicated as the reason for this evacuation. The Russian authorities highlighted the risk of earthquakes. However, we all know that it is not possible to predict earthquakes. The real fear of the Russians who use the excuse of an earthquake is the Ukrainian army advancing on the peninsula. It is clear that the authorities put forward the evacuation plan due to the threat of the Ukrainian troops to the Crimea. So what was the real reason that made the authorities in Crimea so uneasy? Let's look for an answer to this question together. Explosions in Melitopol, especially in the first days of this week, greatly disturbed the Russian presence in Crimea because Melitopol is a critical region controlling the land corridor between Mariupol and Crimea. In addition, the Ukrainian armed forces aim to cut the connection between the Crimea and the Russian army by blowing up Russian headquarters and positions with long-range or inside attacks. The struggle of the Ukrainian forces in Melitopol, known as the gateway to Crimea, does not end for a moment. We can easily see Kiev's determined stance on Crimea in the attacks on these front lines. Not only the explosions in Melitopol, but also the attacks that took place in the inner regions of Crimea worried the Russian authorities. Also this week, Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles made a show of strength in the skies of Crimea and managed to frighten Vladimir Putin. The last of these attacks occurred at around 16:20 local time in the airbase area in Gaverdysk in Crimea, which was temporarily occupied by Russia yesterday. Mysterious Ukrainian weapons struck and blew up the military airbase 240 kilometers from Russia's front line in Crimea. Local residents reported that explosions were heard and seen again in the temporarily occupied Crimea, this time in the area of the military airbase in the urban-type village of Gaverdysk in the Simferopol district. According to local reports, first, a few explosions were heard. Then black smoke appeared above the airbase. According to the claims of Russian officials, Russian air defense systems hit the unmanned aerial vehicle. In addition, a large crater was allegedly found at the scene. The diameter of the crater is about 10 to 12 meters, and the depth is about 3.5 meters. The military air base in the village of Gaverdysk received another incurable wound with the attacks by the mysterious vehicles of Ukraine. In addition to the Gaverdysk attack, Sevastopol and Bakhchisarai near Yalta hosted explosions in Bakhchisarai. The engineering warehouse of the military unit of the 758th Logistics Center of the Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet and the warehouse of the 133rd Brigade of the MTO of the Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet were located. Ukrainian drones targeted these Russian ammunition depots. On the other hand, the Russian Ministry of Defense, which is uneasy about the frequent flying of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles over the skies of Crimea, attracted all the attention with its statements. In his official statement, the Russian defense minister stated that Ukraine targeted the civilian infrastructure in Crimea. This statement made by Russia was denied by the Kiev authorities. However, it is an undeniable fact that there is an increasing activity in Crimea. The Ukrainian military frequently attacks minimum bases, airports, and ammunition depots in Crimea, sowing the seeds of fear in Vladimir Putin's heart. This move by Ukraine scares Russian officials in Crimea, as well as Putin. Russian authorities who want to be protected from Ukraine's attack on Crimea find a solution to evacuate the city piece by piece. Do you think Ukraine can take back Crimea? Let's take a closer look at this possibility together. Once the jewel of the Russian Empire, the strategically important Black Sea region has a long history, including resistance to the Nazis in World War II and more recently, annexation by Vladimir Putin in 2014. Also, two simple geographical facts deserve further attention when trying to understand Putin's objectives in this war. The dependence of Crimea on water resources from mainland Ukraine and the importance of the naval base in Sevastopol. One reason why Crimea is so important is that it is home to the natural hub of Sevastopol, the only deep water port on Russia's Black Sea coast. The ports of Sochi and Novorossiysk are shallow and require ships to anchor in the open. Without Sevastopol, Russia would not have had a home for the Black Sea Fleet, which it used to project its power into the Mediterranean and start a war in Syria. On the other hand, Crimea is an arid peninsula that receives insufficient rainfall to meet the needs of its population of 2 million. After Russia's annexation in 2014, Ukraine dammed the canal 10 miles north of the Crimean border. Since then, Crimea has been drawing water from the now drying and polluted aquifer. Climate change has brought reduced rainfall and higher temperatures to the region, increasing the water deficit. 2 days after the February 24 invasion, Russia blew up the dam, restarting the flow of water into Crimea. In short, the status of Crimea is key to understanding Russia's war against Ukraine, as it is known in the first days of the war. President Vladimir Zelensky was cautious at first when he came to express his ambitions regarding this coastal region. But as the war continued and the Ukrainian troops gained more and more victories on the battlefield, the Kiev leader's stance became clearer. Crimea is Ukraine, and the Kiev armed forces will take it back if Zelensky's determined stance is supported by his Western friends. It is only a matter of time before Crimea falls into the hands of Ukraine as part of the overall effort for Ukraine to win, defeat the Russian forces, and force them to leave Crimea. Western allies have promised Ukraine tanks besides tanks. Ukraine will need long-range precision attack weapons such as long-range ATACMS missiles that can be fired from a truck-mounted HIMARS launcher to successfully drive Russia out of Crimea. As a result, Zelensky realized that the Crimean Union must now be cauterized. Failure to retake the peninsula would mean an ongoing threat to Ukraine's state identity and global security. The fact that Crimea is a concrete target may change the face of the war. With Ukraine's determination to retake Crimea and Russia's insistence that it will defend it, it may only be a matter of time before this conflict turns into a battlefield reality. After a long time in captivity, the freedom struggle of the Ukrainians has begun to increase its influence in recent days. The wind blowing in the Donbass is currently creating a storm in the Crimea. The Ukrainians have completely blockaded Crimea, the most strategic center of the war, for the last 2 weeks. The latest attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces this time targeted Sevastopol, the largest port city in Crimea. According to the governor of the city of Crimea, Ukraine launched the attacks with drone swarms near Sevastopol. Other attacks this week in the north of the peninsula, which Kiev insisted on retaking from Russian occupation, were already heralded. Ukraine's drone army tried to hit the coastal base in Sevastopol. Moscow-backed Sevastopol Governor Mikhail Razvozhayev stated that the Ukrainian attacks were stopped by Russia's Black Sea Fleet. However, after the airstrikes of the Ukrainian forces, a serious fire started in the region. A video of this fire, which broke out near the entrance to the Sevastopol Bay, was shared on social media, but it was not clear what exactly burned. Rawasi reported that 3 surface drones were destroyed. At around 5 a.m. he reported that the Navy crews fired small arms at the Ukrainian drones and also that the Russian air defense was active to repel the attacks. In the statements also reported by the Russian state news agency RIA Novosti, Raiz Vozhdayev stated that Russian warships were not damaged in this drone attack. However, no definitive proof has been presented in this regard. Also in a follow-up post, the governor of Sevastopol stated that Ukrainians had launched an information attack. Radio signals were cut off to spread the word that passengers on ferries on the peninsula were evacuated. Ravasiev claimed that this was completely false news, but according to Transport Sevastopol's Telegram channel on the morning of the attack, passenger transport by sea in Sevastopol was suspended. The RIA reported that the blasts completely shattered the windows into buildings in the city center. The report also emphasized that since last July, Ukrainian forces have once again targeted the city, which is the main base of the Black Sea Fleet with UAVs. RIA added that most of the drones were destroyed by air defense systems. These stunning drone attacks were not limited to Sevastopol either. Ukraine's drone army recently targeted the Crimean city of Tanki. Videos of the explosion that took place in this Russian-controlled town have emerged. The Ukrainian military intelligence agency announced that the explosion in the town of Tanki in the north of Crimea destroyed the Russian Kalibr cruise missiles while being transported by rail. The missiles were to be transported by rail to be launched from Russian ships in Moscow's Black Sea Fleet in the Crimean port city of Sevastopol. Anton Geraskinko, advisor to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, shared footage of the explosion on Twitter, and a voice in the video confirmed that the explosion was filmed around the town's train station. In another clip shared by journalist Maria Avdeeva, a beam of light and a loud explosion could be heard from the camera's vantage point without directly taking responsibility for the explosion. The main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine stated that the Russian Kalibr missiles destroyed in the explosions have a range of more than 1,500 miles against land targets and more than 230 miles against sea targets. The statements of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense actually pointed out that a great danger was averted. On March 9, Kiev officials reported that 20 Kalibr sea-launched cruise missiles were fired overnight into Ukrainian territory as part of a wave of attacks across the war-torn country. Ukrainian forces had previously managed to thwart the threat of a new Russian missile attack with an army of drones. The Russian-backed mayor of Tsankawi, Igor Ivan, stated that the explosion occurred as a result of an unmanned aerial vehicle attack and that the air defense should be improved as soon as possible. In addition, Igor Ivan declared a state of emergency in Tsankawi, where the danger still remains. Sergei Aksionov, a Kremlin-backed official who has served as the leader of Crimea since the peninsula was annexed 9 years ago, said that as a result of the attacks in Sanki, 1 person was injured and 2 buildings were damaged. But Aksionov did not mention the Russian cruise missiles destroyed in these explosions. Sanki, which serves as a major base for the Russian army, is home to one of Russia's largest air bases in Crimea. The Defense Ministry considers the town a key road and rail junction that plays an important role in enabling Russia's operations in southern Ukraine. For this reason, the drone attacks of the Ukrainian forces on the city caused serious concern to the Russians. Although the Russian authorities claim that these attacks in Crimea do not cause a great danger, the situation in the peninsula is quite critical because an airstrike occurs in Crimea almost every day. While the situation on the front in Ukraine was in such a critical state, the issues related to the peace talks proposed to end the war began to come to the fore following the Ukrainian attacks in Crimea. Important statements were made by Russia regarding peace talks. Russia's foreign ministry has rejected a proposal that Ukraine's most powerful Western partners participate in final peace talks to end Moscow's ongoing occupation of its neighbor. The Russian ministry reported that the US, Britain, Germany, and France cannot be considered reliable mediators in any peace negotiations due to their involvement in the conflict, which is now in its 2nd year. Tensions in the war escalated even more after the Russian Foreign Ministry rejected the latest proposal by senior German diplomat Wolfgang Ischinger that the US, Britain, France, and Germany form the core of a Western mediation group to put an end to the war. The official of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs said these countries support the so-called peace initiatives of Zelensky, which is an ultimatum for our country to surrender. With such approach the USA, England, France, and Germany cannot claim to be impartial mediators initiating the peace process. They are not interested in resolving the crisis and are doing everything they can to maximize conflict. In reality, Russia remains the only obstacle to peace in Ukraine. Only Russia can end this war today. In other words, the statements of the Russian Foreign Ministry do not mean anything other than escalating this war. These statements are seen as purely an excuse for the Russians who do not want to approach peace. The US, on the other hand, wants to see this war come to an end. But for peace to be lasting, it must be just and secure. The policy followed by the US administration is exactly in this direction. But the Russians do not take a peaceful stance. On the other hand, it is the goal of Kiev's allies to ensure that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position for negotiation. To this end, the US administration is helping Ukraine regain control and defend territory seized by Russia since February 2022 or since 2014. There seems to be almost no hope for the renewal of peace talks as the massive invasion of Russia continues. Negotiations began only hours after the start of the Russian offensive on February 24, 2022. But from the very beginning, these peace talks did not work out due to espionage and mistrust. In the spring of 2022, talks were interrupted entirely amid growing evidence of Russian atrocities. Although the two sides met to conclude a grain export agreement covering the Black Sea, there were no negotiations to temporarily or permanently end the war. President Volodymyr Zelensky proposed a 10-point peace agreement that includes the withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory, compensation for war damage and war crimes, prosecution for Russian leaders. Moscow immediately rejected this offer for negotiations to be fruitful. The warring parties must have a genuine interest in sitting at the table. There is a lot of news from the south here in preparation for the coming Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. Russian forces have been increasing the density of their fortifications, expecting to stop them on the first line. However, recent news suggests that the Ukrainians developed ballistic missiles with a range of more than 400 kilometers and have already started targeting critical supply lines in Crimea. Last time I told you that Ukrainians are getting closer to Russian positions and conducting reconnaissance in force operations to reveal the weaknesses in the Russian defense. I also told you that in doing so, Ukrainians managed to reduce the gray zones between Ukrainian and Russian positions, especially in the area of Robotnik and Bilohirya. The freshest reports suggest that the Ukrainians have successfully reduced the gray zones even more and got very close to several more Russian positions. Recent geolocated photos published by Russian media show that Ukrainians created several positions in 3 lines deep south of Orikhiv. These positions are located west of Nestorenko, which already allows Ukrainians to attack it from at least 2 directions. Operating in such close proximity to the village allowed Ukrainian drone operators to start destroying Russian defensive infrastructure such as counter-battery radars on the roofs. Russian sources also reported that Ukrainians increased the concentration of their forces in the region. According to this report, one assault group arrived at Komishuvaka and still has not been deployed to the Zero Line. Another assault group with a lot of experience in urban fighting was reportedly relocated from Bakhmut to the Holy Pole area, and the Holy Pole direction is starting to activate as well. Recent combat footage reveals that Ukrainians are actively firing at the Russian positions in Doroshenko. Doroshenko is a small settlement, however. It is the only village that separates the 2 biggest strongholds in this part of the region, Holy Pole and Polig. The use of mortars and artillery signals about the preparation for the offensive actions as Ukrainian 44th Artillery Brigade, which is responsible for both the Orikhiv and Holy Pole sectors, is increasingly targeting Russian positions in the tree lines. Here in the fields, trees are the only objects that can obstruct the view. So almost all trenches are located here. In order to boost their defense, Russians started deploying the mine-laying vehicle GMZ-3. The vehicle is designed for anti-tank mining and can place mines in the ground with camouflage. Simultaneously, Ukrainians started testing American special equipment M58 mine-clearing line charge. M58 is an explosive line charge which provides a lane 8 meters by 100 meters. Russian forces are trying to identify where such equipment is located and destroy it as soon as possible to undermine Ukrainian offensive capabilities. Today, Russian sources reported that Russian aviation conducted an airstrike targeting a concentration of equipment over the last week. The strikes on rear positions by both parties became very common over the last 4 days. Ukrainians reportedly hit Russian bases in Tokmak, Molokhansk, Myrna and Melitopol with HIMARS. The targets were various from substations that power local trains to logistical centers, ammunition depots, and forces concentrations in order to clear the sky for the rockets. Ukrainian air reconnaissance and artillery crews are actively hunting down Russian medium-range air defense. The reach of Ukrainian artillery is constantly increasing. 2 days ago, Russian sources reported about the redeployment of several HIMARS crews to the Kherson region. And shortly after that, the locals from Armyansk reported that they heard several explosions. However, the biggest news by far is that Russians reportedly shot down several ballistic missiles in Valdorcha. Geolocated footage showed an explosion near the Russian anti-aircraft missile base. Up until that point, the only way Ukrainians could reach Crimea was by using various aerial and amphibious drones. Russian sources reported that Ukrainians had developed the operational tactical missile system Grom-2 by modernizing its previous version. Some sources claim that the rockets were launched from the Kherson region and traveled around 260 kilometers, while other sources say that it was launched from the Odessa region and traveled for 115 kilometers. It looks like the second scenario is correct, and Ukrainians already possess the missiles that are capable of destroying the Crimean bridge before the counteroffensive operation even begins. Such a development would significantly reduce Russian capabilities of supplying the southern group right when it would be needed the most.